undergrads to go to this conference? Yeah, I was just talking to a former grad student from our And thank you all for being here. I appreciate it, especially since it is the last session of the conference, and I'm sure you all had lots of different events to attend last night, stayed up late, etc. For those of you who are joining us virtually, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the case may be, and thank you for spending part of your valuable weekend with us. So we are going to be talking about job insecurity research that we've all been doing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and also with the backdrop of automation. So I wanted to welcome you to the session on behalf of my colleague Lisine Zhang, who is the co-chair for this session, but was unable to attend from New Zealand due to COVID travel restrictions. But I'm hoping that she's here virtually. Hi, Lisine. All right, so just by way of background, so obviously prior to the pandemic, lots of employees were worried about the future of their job due to obsolescence, due to technology change, and so on. And I think when we think about technology change and automation, a lot of us think about robots and how that might be affecting the obsolescence of various jobs, as shown in the picture here. But also, as we've seen, a lot of sessions at SciOp over these past few days have been looking at the impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and so there are lots of different forms of technology that are potentially threatening the way in which we do our jobs and, in fact, the very nature and existence of our jobs. So we're looking at the context of automation. And of course, many of these trends were accelerated during the pandemic, and there was the concomitant economic crisis where we saw record numbers of people become unemployed abruptly during the pandemic. And now, of course, we hear, on the opposite end about the Great Resignation and the difficulty in bringing employees back to the workplace. But there still is pervasive job insecurity, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And so our presentations today are going to be looking at, again, a number of these issues in the context over the past couple of years. So we have 5 different proposed presentations. One of them, the speaker wasn't able to be here, but we're going to kick things off with a presentation by Michael Destazo, and he's going to be talking about layoff and furlough events and how that affects employee well-being as mediated by job insecurity. And I think his research is really interesting because it doesn't just look at layoffs and furloughs as discrete events that are just either bad or good, but actually looks at the different nature and the features of those layoff and furlough events to look at them from a richer perspective in terms of how they might impact job insecurity and well-being. And then Andrea will be following that up later with a presentation entitled, "Are Our Best Days Still Ahead of Us? Job Insecurity and Work Selves During the Pandemic." And so in that research, we were interested in looking at kind of how people's dreams and hopes for their future careers were abruptly altered by the pandemic, and how, whether or not they still have clarity and feel like they can reach those dreams, how that affects their perceptions and reactions to job insecurity. Then the third presentation, I'll be back up on stage because my colleague Micah Debut from Switzerland was not able to join us today because of, again, travel issues. But in that study, The Long Reach of Unemployment, Employee Reactions to Subsequent Job Insecurity, we are also looking at how people's current reactions to job insecurity are going to be affected by their prior experiences of unemployment. Fourth study is led by Lysine, and that is a really interesting 7-year longitudinal study looking at the relationship between job insecurity and job and life satisfaction. But unfortunately, she isn't here to be able to present that, so I'll just go through those slides really quickly, but you'll be able to get those from the online forum. And then finally, Laura's gonna close things out for us, and we'll be talking about how to measure employees' perceived threat of automation. And we'll be talking about the research that she's been doing to develop and validate a new measure of occupation insecurity. So with that, I will let Michael take things over.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Michael Destazo. I'm representing the University of Central Florida, and I'm going to present some work that I think is really interesting. I hope you guys find it interesting. So I think I'll start off by saying that layoff and furlough events, just like was previously described, you can think of them as a binary event, but I kind of like to do research on events, and I like to explore them a little bit more. So I like to break down, like, okay, what are the features of different events that make them different from, you know, my layoff or furlough experience, different from another person's layoff or furlough experience. So that'll be sort of the theme, and I will go ahead and get started. So jumping in with workers' experiences. So at the beginning of the pandemic, unprecedented number of layoff and furlough experiences, and you could think of it as like a binary event. So you could think of like, okay, if I was laid off, that's a bad thing. If I was furloughed, that's a bad thing. And if I wasn't laid off or furloughed, then that's a good thing, and I'm gonna, you know, feel great about it. I think in reality, you find that people have different varying types of experiences. So you can be furloughed for a long period of time. You can have a particularly negative furlough experience. You could have been furloughed for a short period of time and then eventually laid off. Or you could have been furloughed for, I mean, some people upwards of a year and then finally laid off. So the COVID-19 pandemic was a really great opportunity to study those kinds of things, but I'm hoping to show you guys a little bit later when I get to the discussion at the end that maybe there's some broader implications that we can have. So that's sort of the distinguish between the assumptions with the layoff and furlough events and then the reality of those events. In terms of specific features of the layoff and furlough events, we were inspired by event systems theory. And so event systems theory is not really a theory of employee well-being or a theory of occupational health psychology, but it's really interesting because it shows different ways that events can affect across different levels of an organization. So for example, you could have an event at the organizational level or at the societal level, and that could trickle down and affect individuals. The other really interesting thing about event systems theory is that it shows the different kinds of features that might be important. And so there's criticality, duration, novelty. So novelty, for example, the uniqueness of an event. Duration would be like the length of the event, so thinking for a layoff and furlough, how long that furlough lasted or how long that layoff event lasted before securing new employment, and criticality, sort of like the importance or meaningfulness of the event. And so the event systems theory is sort of talking, okay, there are stronger events and weaker events, and all of these, you know, when present, contribute to making a stronger event versus, you know, event that really isn't as important and isn't as impactful. And in terms of, you know, taking this theory and applying it to well-being or applying it to sort of OHP, event systems theory says that events impact the extent of their impact. So, you know, the greater impact if the event is of higher strength. And so we kind of reasoned that, okay, if we look at more impactful layoff or furlough events are probably more likely to impact well-being. So that's sort of us taking this theory and applying it to OHP. And then what we also wanted to look at, because another research of interest of mine is people's expectations of what will happen in the future. So when I think about job insecurity, it's sort of like the expectation that something negative will happen to my job. So there's the qualitative side and the quantitative side. And I'm sort of inspired by, research in cognitive psychology, sort of saying that, okay, events that happen in our past or the things that happen to us are gonna shape what we think will happen in the future. So we reasoned for that, that job insecurity would be a mediator of this relationship, so between layoff and furlough event characteristics and well-being. And so just to jump in a little bit on the qualitative JI, so qualitative JI is worry about the quality of the job, that you might lose important features of your job that you really value, whereas the quantitative JI is worrying about job loss. And so we looked at both of those in this study. So here's a quick view of the mediation model. So we looked at novelty, criticality, and duration. And then we also looked at qualitative and quantitative JI as potential mediators, and mental health is the DV that we're looking at here. In terms of the participants, so we recruited participants from, they were theme park employees affiliated with the labor union in the Southeast US, so you might be able to guess which theme park employees those people might belong to. So that was our sample. In terms of eligibility criteria, they had to have been laid off or furloughed at the beginning of the pandemic. This is part of a critical incident study. So they reported different characteristics. We asked them a lot of different questions about how they were laid off and furloughed, and then we asked them our quantitative items. So novelty, criticality, duration. We asked them about their job insecurity at a later time point, and then finally their mental health. And so we were able to get 88 participants, and this took place over about actually almost exactly a year ago. So think mid-pandemic, probably when Omicron was coming. So that's the context of the study. In terms of descriptives, there were just a couple things I wanted to point out here. So some of it, so when we look at the quantitative JI, so thinking these are people that were laid off, had returned by now, and these are people that had just recently returned to work. And so for that reason, you'll notice that our mean on the quantitative JI was actually pretty low. And so I think that's, I'm thinking most likely that people had just returned to their work. So maybe they're not worrying about job loss at that point. And I think that was the most important thing from here. But of course, if you have any questions afterwards about the descriptives, I'm happy to answer them. In terms of the first mediation model results, so we looked at quantitative JI first and qualitative JI second. In terms of the quantitative JI, we found no support for the indirect effect there, possibly due to the range restriction there. And the other thing I'll mention is that of the event characteristics, none of them came out in terms of supporting a main effect or an indirect effect. So when we look at duration, criticality, and novelty, only duration had effects here. So this slide and the next slide, so we found no support for the indirect effect, marginally significant direct effect of duration on quantitative JI, but no indirect effect there. In terms of the second mediation model, that's where we find a little bit more support here. So we have duration having an effect on qualitative GI, eventually leading to poor mental health. And the indirect effect there is statistically significant. So we see that, there's qualitative GI is transferring that effect of the impact duration on mental well-being. So just some thoughts I have about this. So workers who experience layoff and furlough events with long-lasting impact, which is what I mean by impact duration, were more likely to feel that their job could change in the future in a negative way, and of course that impacted mental health as well. Not much support for the other event characteristics. So when we looked at criticality, we looked at a couple other, we measured a lot of event characteristics, so like negative valence of the event, for example, not much effect there either, but duration seemed to have the strongest effect there. So it could be that impact duration is a better indicator of event strength for layoff and furlough events specifically. And the other interesting thing from our findings is that no results for the quantitative GI. So having a long lasting furlough didn't really impact well-being through quant GI. And then after returning to work, kind of what I was mentioning before, people might feel secure, and just because of the timing of our study, it could be that people had just recently returned, and for that reason, we're having a little bit of range restriction on our quant JI variable. So people might have felt secure about, feeling that maybe I wouldn't lose my job at that point, but maybe I could lose valuable job features. So just a little bit more about that. I wanted to point out that I think this work is really important because we're looking at frontline workers, shift workers, and hospitality workers, kind of an understudied population in our research. Another thing I'll point out is range restriction. Again, I kind of mentioned that before. And then I think we need a little bit more work, so we're planning like a follow-up study to look at the duration of these effects to see if, okay, maybe if we follow up with people maybe a year later, what are the effects on quantitative GI? And I just would like to acknowledge a few people. Some of these people are in the audience, so Mindy's my faculty mentor. And so Amanda and Ann are graduate students that has helped with this paper. And then stressful events and experiences researchers were involved in the data collection. And of course, the Sunshine ERC funded this study, so I'm really happy for their involvement. Oh, and thank you so much. I could take questions now, or if we want to hold them till the end, I can take questions at the end as well.
Yeah, we can do them now if the people have them.
Yeah.
I actually had one. Can you talk a little bit more about criticality? Like how is that defined and operationalized? I think like duration is pretty clear, but
Yeah.
criticality.
Yeah, criticality. Yeah, so criticality, so the items themselves, they relate more to the consequences of the event. So saying, like, in terms of how they looked, it was more like, okay, the layoff and furlough event had major negative consequences for me. So that's kind of how they're worded. But that's sourced right from, and we actually drew from event systems theory, like there were items originally developed there, and we tweaked them to make them fit layoff, furlough events.
Yeah, and I think maybe, you're talking about the range restriction.
Yeah.
It could be in part, back then that was at the point where vaccines were widely available and the actual case numbers were at the lowest, I think, during the pandemic. So it was that summer lull where everybody was thinking this was it was done, it was over. So,
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you.
Sure. We didn't, but I think that would be really interesting to study. I think like because we have so many event characteristics that we collected, I think we collected about 6 or 7, and I think I would want to look at different interactions between those, or potentially possibly profiles of the event characteristics. That could be another interesting way to look at it. Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning after all these parties. I'm Andrea. I will be presenting this brief talk about our best days are ahead of us, job insecurity and possible work selves during the pandemic. So, in early 2020, late 2019, everything was good. We were blissfully unaware of what was going to happen. The economy was great. Unemployment was really low. But then we all know how that went. COVID and the twin crisis, health crisis, and also economic crisis, they really halted the expectations that people had about the future. We're thinking about, well, we're turning into 2020, new decades, a lot of hopes, and COVID kind of put those on a halt. So with that background, the idea of this paper is building upon the well-studied, well-documented by several meta-analyses, the effects of job insecurity on 3 outcomes. Today we're looking at in-role performance, task performance, right? Perceived promotion opportunities and effective commitment. So we all know job insecurity tends to be associated negatively with those, and there's also a host of theories as to why this happened. What we're looking at today is whether possible work selves, might moderate those relationships. And I'll define work selves in a bit, but the idea is that the possible work selves, the idea is taken from counseling psychology, marriage psychology, and it was first applied to divorce, right? When you're not in a marriage, you have an expectation that will continue in the future, and then when a divorce happens, that marriage no longer exists. So the idea is to apply that idea to work and organizational psych. So possible selves are basically cognitive representations of future goals, aspirations, and thinking about the future and what the goals are for like a future, like for a year from today, 5 years from today, like this cognitive representation of what we will be in the future. Applied to work, right, is that the idea where we'll be in our career in the future. Okay? How do we see ourselves career-wise in a year, in 6 months, a year, 5 years, or any other time frame? And the interesting thing is that it's the salience of those future selves. Is that easy for us to imagine where we'll be? Is that like does it come in naturally? Is it rather, is that picture clear? Can we just really, really imagine, is that like salient in our mind? Is that, or is rather something that we don't really think about, or is more like, I'm not sure, like the picture is unclear, who knows, right? The idea of salience is how easy it is for us, is the extent to which participants and an individual think about those selves, those cognitive representations, and how easy is that for them to do so. I put here a brief definition. That's what we use to prime participants to think about their future work selves in a context of COVID-19. So we asked them to consider your future as you imagined before COVID-19. Try to remember how you imagine your future to be. What sorts of things did you hope for and dream about for your career? So think in terms of your best possible career if COVID had not happened, right? It's this kind of like cognitive task that we gave them. Okay, think about it. Assuming COVID didn't exist, where did you see your career going? And then we asked them to briefly jot down a few words about what those future work selves are. So in terms of this study, as I mentioned before, we're looking at this model. It's really, really simple. It's a moderated model. And we're looking at whether future work selves moderate the relationships between job insecurity and those three outcomes. The idea being that if participants have a higher salience, it's easier for them to think about their future self, their future, the career. If COVID had not happened, then job insecurity is still relevant for them. It's still a threat to their own like ideal career path. It's still something that could potentially harm their career. And so we expect a stronger relationship for those people. Whereas if it's if future work selves are less salient, perhaps job insecurity isn't as relevant, right? So they lost that ideal career if COVID didn't happen. They lost it. They don't care. So why would job insecurity matter? It couldn't matter because it could just be a further confirmation that what they lost. They had this idea, this best career that they couldn't imagine of. They lost it, and then job insecurity might just be a confirmation, might just be like another signal that that career is gone. With that said, our data set is about 360 US employees. We collected data in August 2020, so about 2 years ago. 84% of them were working full-time. They were working at the same workplace for about 7 years and a half. We had a bit more male participants than female, and 75% of them identified as white. and the average age was about 41 years with a standard deviation of 11. The measures we used for job insecurity, we used the Job Security Index, and then for work selves perceptions, we used a 3-item scale by Caroline Strauss et al. For the we measured in-role performance, task performance, with the usual Williams and Anderson scale, the 4-item well-known scale. Promotion opportunities were measured using the Job Descriptive Index subscale, and then effective commitment, we took that scale from Mayer et al. So without further ado, those are the results for in-role performance. So at the bottom of the slides, you can see the parameter estimates. Just want to point you at the direct effect of work self-perceptions, right? Adjusting for job insecurity, and then as you can see, the interaction term is significant, which I plotted here. As we expected, and as you can see from the simple slopes analysis, so as the work self-perceptions were higher, then the relationship between job insecurity and in-role performance was stronger. Whereas when the work self-perceptions were lower, then the relationship is basically null. It's a flat slope. The same pattern can be seen for promotion opportunities as well. As before, at the bottom of the slides, you can see the parameter estimates, and then the simple slopes here, as was the case for promotion task performance. At higher levels of work self-perceptions, the relationship is stronger, is more negative, and it decreases, it becomes flatter as the when work self-perceptions are low. Basically, people can't think of their work selves anymore. And the last outcome, effective commitment, again, same pattern. The interaction still significant, same pattern as before. The different slopes still there at higher level of work self-perception. The slope is steeper compared to lower levels work self-perception. Again, so people that can still think and see their possible work selves as relevant, they show a stronger negative relationship between job insecurity and effective commitment. So why does this matter, right? The idea of thinking about or envisioning possible work selves could be a motivational resource, could be like a compass that guides participants or employees towards, it guides them, it gives them a direction towards what they want to achieve in the future. And it seems to predict creative behaviors and a host of other outcomes as well. As I mentioned before, it's kind of like a compass, gives people a direction to follow in order to get the career outcomes that they'd like. So as I mentioned throughout this brief talk, employees that perceived that despite the pandemic, they could still achieve their best possible work self, their work self is attainable to an extent. They reacted more negatively to job insecurity, because job insecurity is still relevant to them. It's still a threat, still something that could really wreak havoc of their expectations. Whereas if employees reported the pre-COVID work self was not attainable, was not relevant, then job insecurity didn't really matter. The slope was flat for task performance. It was flatter for the other two outcomes. So perhaps it's not as relevant for them, because it's just like it's a further confirmation of what they already know, what they already lost. So where do we go from here? First, the limitation, those were cross-sectional results. So the usual, take those results with a grain of salt. Cross-sectional, self-reported, so covariations could be inflated. right? It's due to common method variance, the usual disclaimer. Where we see this work going is the exploring, right? If you recall, we primed them to write down what they were thinking about as they work, possible work selves. So we want to explore that and turn those results into a mixed method studies, not just looking at the relationship per se, but why that happened. Is there any meaningful differences between what people that, for instance, are higher in, that it was easier for them to get work self? Was that any qualitatively different from people that felt that they lost their future work selves, perhaps? And last, what we see this study going is by continuing studying the outcomes and the pervasive economic stressor and the idea of what might have been. It's not just what happened, but what might have been because of COVID. It's not, okay, well, yes, COVID hit. It was a health crisis, economic crisis, but what could have been if COVID did not happen? You know, the future might still be bright. Some people were indeed able to still think about clearly their career, where they want to go. Perhaps that career will be different from what they envisioned before COVID. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, that's a very good point. We didn't look at gender differences. We also didn't enter gender as a covariate, but I think it's a really good point that you mentioned. Absolutely, I think it's worthwhile looking whether there's gender affects the salience of possible work selves. Absolutely, you know, in light of the COVID pandemic and the gender differences that have been perhaps uncovered and exacerbated by COVID-19.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, I think what's really interesting about the different studies that are being presented here is that they're taking more of a lifespan perspective on job insecurity. So, so Michael's research is looking at kind of how past experiences intersect with current experiences of job insecurity. Andrea's is looking at kind of how job insecurity and things like the COVID-19 pandemic can interrupt the possible attainment of one's future conceived work selves, those best possible work selves. And so the research that I'm going to be presenting today on behalf of Micah and my colleagues is continuing along that theme, where we're looking at what we call the long reach of unemployment and how prior experiences of unemployment might affect employee reactions to subsequent job insecurity. So we know, of course, that unemployment is a critical life event, and there's been a lot of research, meta-analyses that have shown that unemployment is associated with numerous physical, psychological, adverse outcomes, impaired well-being, and so on. We also know that this research shows that unemployment, those negative effects can persist even after an individual has regained their employment. So again, the aim of the present study was to view unemployment experiences in the context of subsequently experienced job insecurity. And part of the reason why we asked this research question was, well, two different reasons. So one of them was kind of empirical. So if you look at prior meta-analyses on job insecurity, there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the effect sizes. So a lot of commonly studied variables, if you look at job insecurity and these various consequences, there's a lot of varying effect sizes that can be observed. And this suggests potentially the presence of moderator variables that have been unexplored. So that was one reason. The other thing, again, is kind of continuing on the theme of the session, is that a lot of the research on a lot of workplace stressors, but in particular also economic stressors, is really taken much more of a contemporaneous perspective. So we tend to look at a lot of different mediators and moderators, but those tend to be personality-based or situational moderators. There's a lot of really interesting multi-level research that looks at contextual variables at the work group or organizational or national culture levels and how those affect people's reactions to job insecurity. But just as individuals do not live within a contextual vacuum with respect to their work group or their supervisors or their organizations, they also don't live in a time vacuum. And so the way in which we react to our current situation with respect to job insecurity might be affected by those prior historical and past experiences that we've experienced. And so the ones that we're looking at specifically here are those career shocks that have occurred due to unemployment experiences. And as we started to ask the question about, well, how would those prior experiences of unemployment affect people's reactions to currently experienced job insecurity, we kind of realized that we weren't sure how we would answer that question. Is it actually the case that having those prior unemployment experiences, would that make people react more negatively to subsequently experienced job insecurity? Or might it actually lead them to react less negatively? And so this gave us two different kind of competing hypotheses, which is always nice, because then regardless of what you find, it's interesting, right? But the stress sensitization perspective says that these prior experiences are going to sensitize us and make us react more so have higher levels of reactivity to subsequent stress. So if you think about it within the context of conservation of resources theories, we know that a lot of these economic stressors co-occur and can result in loss spirals, loss of resources, higher vulnerability. There's a lot of support for this stress sensitization perspective in the field of affective disorders, looking at the experiences of early childhood events. And also findings on repeated spells of unemployment. So there is some theory and research to suggest that you would actually see greater reactivity, more negative reactions. On the other hand, you can look at it from a stress inoculation perspective, that when people are exposed to adverse events, they learn coping skills, they learn strategies for dealing with these stressful events. And so when you come across similar kinds of stressful events, so maybe perhaps not losing your employment, but the threat of losing your employment, that you might have better coping mechanisms to adapt and react and cope with those stressors. The other possible mechanism for the stress inoculation perspective comes from relative deprivation theory. And so it might be that employees are comparing their current situation with the situation of their past self, which was an even worse situation, where they just worried about losing their job, they actually did lose their job. They actually had that worst case scenario of having lost their job and lived through it. And so there might be these past self comparisons that even though they're experiencing job insecurity, it's not as bad as what they have experienced in the past. And so this might result in kind of a buffering effect. So to answer these questions, we had 3 different data sets from the US and Germany. So the 2 from the US were 2-wave studies. These were collected pre-pandemic and each had a 1-month time lag. The cross-sectional data set from Germany, that was collected during the pandemic. And so we'll talk about some of the interesting differences that we found in the results and that they might be due to the historical time frame in which we collected the data, as well as the different cultural contexts. In all of these data sets, we gathered a range of typical outcomes that have been studied in relationship to job insecurity, so things like in-role task performance, well-being, task-related self-efficacy, safety behavior, and so on. We also used across the different studies different kinds of operationalizations for prior unemployment experiences. So in some of the studies, we just looked at it from a dichotomous perspective, either no prior experienced unemployment within the past 5 years or some experience of unemployment. And then in one of the studies, we operationalized it as a count variable. So we actually looked at how many different instances. I wish we had done what you had done and actually looked at some of those, the criticality and the novelty and duration. We do have information on duration. We could go back and look at that. And then for job insecurity, we have both affective and cognitive measures. But in a nutshell, just to preview some of the findings, most of the effects that we found were actually in line with that stress inoculation perspective, with a couple of exceptions that we'll talk about. So from the first data set, we measured affective job insecurity. So an example item there, it's upsetting how little job security I have. So this is looking at emotional reactions to perceived job insecurity. And this was a dichotomous measure of prior unemployment experiences. So just have you been unemployed within the past 5 years? And we found buffering effects for all of the outcomes. So looking at cognitive failures, safety compliance, in-role task performance, task-related self-efficacy. In each case, we found a similar pattern as shown here. So this is specifically for in-role behaviors. But as you can see, for individuals who did not have any prior unemployment, we find the traditionally expected relationship, such that higher levels of job insecurity is associated with lower levels of in-role behaviors. However, as you can see, for the individuals who had experienced prior unemployment, that relationship was nearly completely attenuated. Okay, so we found that buffering effect. And again, we found that for all of those other outcomes listed as well. In the second US data set, we also measured affective job insecurity, but in this case, we asked them how many times they had been unemployed within the past 5 years. So not just dichotomous, but have some measure of the number of different repeated events. And again, we found buffering effects for the vast majority of the outcomes that we studied. So cognitive failures, safety compliance, in-role performance, so those were all replicating the prior data sets effects, but also in this study, new effects for sleep disturbances, job-related affective well-being, and also mental health. And so the sample plot here shows the effect for mental health. So there's clearly also a main effect that higher levels of prior unemployment, we know from lots of research that unemployment has negative adverse effects on mental health, and that shows up in our main effects. But we also, however, find that relationship between currently experienced job insecurity and subsequent time to mental health is attenuated among those individuals who have had more prior unemployment experiences. So those were the US data sets, again, collected pre-pandemic. Then for the German data set, this one used a measure of cognitive job insecurity, so switching from affective to cognitive, so just a more perceptual thing, my job is secure, so not asking about affective reactions to that. And then again, using a dichotomous measure of prior unemployment experiences. So there were some buffering effects, for example, for career reorientation, but there were intensifying effects for job satisfaction and turnover intentions. So as you can see, for individuals who had prior unemployment experiences, we found that relationship between job insecurity and job satisfaction was in fact magnified in this particular data set. So, oops, let me just make sure I didn't skip anything. So the major findings then across all the 3 different data sets, they largely are in line with that stress inoculation perspective, but again, we do have some outlier or different effects that we're seeing in the German data set, and there are a number of different reasons why that might occur. It could be, again, because of the vastly different historical, perspective or context in terms of that being collected during the pandemic. It could be due to the fact that it's cross-sectional data. It was using not an affective measure of job insecurity, but a cognitive one. There are also very different social safety nets between Germany and the United States. So there's a number of different variables that we have to explore to kind of consider why we might have seen some of those differing effects. In our next steps, and Micah has actually already started to explore some of this in data that she's recently collected, is to look at what are some of the underlying mechanisms that might be explaining that. Because again, we theorized maybe it's due to relative deprivation, for example, or maybe there's information that we should have about how much actual prior resource loss had they experienced. And at least when it comes to relative deprivation, it does look like that is operating as a mediating mechanism. So for among individuals where we see that buffering relationship between job insecurity and outcomes, to the extent that they are having these comparisons to their prior selves, then we see that attenuating effect. So just again, to recap kind of our theoretical and practical implications, I think this research, again, helps to reinforce, along with the other research that's been being shown here today, the importance of introducing kind of a whole life and lifespan, career span perspective to research on job insecurity and economic stressors and work stress more generally. So it's really important not just to look at where we currently are, but where we have been and also where we hope to be in the future, and take into account that continuum. Also, organizations and managers from a practical standpoint should clearly consider previous employment history and prior experiences of unemployment in these economically turbulent times. But we also want to caveat that with saying that, you know, they shouldn't exploit the fact that, oh, these employees tend to be even more resilient, and so we don't have to worry about them. That's not at all the message that we want to have as our takeaway here today. And with that, thank you, and I will open it up to any questions for now. All right, no questions? Okay, well, in that case then, let's see, actually I need to really quickly go through. So this is Lysine's presentation. I'm not going to be able to give it, but it is available online. So, but again, looking at some really interesting relationships between job insecurity and well-being over 7 time points. So, all right.
Hello everyone, also from my side. I'm Lara, and I will be switching gears a little bit. So I will continue on the topic of insecurity. However, I will be talking about insecurity due to automation. And at this point, I would also like to acknowledge my collaborators, namely Professor De Witte from Belgium, Professor Wang from China, and my colleagues from the Oxford Institute of Population Aging in the UK. So just to give you a little bit of a background how we got into this research. My grandfather actually still learned the occupation of cart wheeler. And even at his time, this was already an occupation that was becoming redundant. So he actually ended up never working in this occupation for a day in his life. Fast forward to the present time, I have been working in assessment centers for a few years. So I was at the front line, you know, with the IO psychologist, running the exercises with prospective employees, with job applicants. And those of you who are in that assessment center space or have maybe attended some of those sessions here at SIOP will be aware that a lot has happened in that space over the past few years. So nowadays, actually, so many platforms run completely without a human or IO psychologist having to run any of those exercises. So it's all automated, even the scoring can be automated. So this occupation clearly has changed a lot. Well, in contrast to my grandfather, I'm not really worried that my occupation will become completely obsolete, because even in the assessment center space, they will still need IO psychologists to analyze the data, to design those exercises, etc. However, it's probably, or it has already significantly changed, and probably it will continue to change a lot. So this was kind of like the basis for our research, namely asking ourselves, okay, do employees actually perceive that their occupations might be at risk due to automation, or that they might be significantly changing due to automation? And this gave rise to the question of whether employees experience what we term occupation insecurity. So in the following few minutes, I will give you a little bit more background, then talk about occupation insecurity as this new concept, and talk about the scale that we have developed in order to measure it, how we validated it, and then also give you some preliminary findings. So the background: in 2020, so just with the beginning of the pandemic, the World Economic Forum published the Future of Jobs report, in which it was talking about this double disruption effect. So meaning automation was already in full swing before the pandemic, but due to COVID, it became even more accelerated. And therefore, they estimated that about 85 million jobs would be eliminated due to automation by 2025 already. However, on the bright side, they also estimated that 97 million jobs would be created, meaning in the end, actually more jobs would be created than lost. However, since the time frame has now become so short, they pointed out that they expect that about 50% of all employees will need some level of reskilling or upskilling by 2025. So that means that our window of opportunity to actually support workers in getting those skills has become a lot shorter. Even before the pandemic, there was a highly publicized article by Frey and Osborne who looked at what were at the time the main occupations in the US and looked, okay, within those occupations, what kinds of tasks could we automate? And they came up with a figure that was then all over the news, namely that 47% of jobs are at risk of being automated. So quite a significant number. And in that same publication, they also published this graph where we can see on the one side those occupations that would be at less of a risk of being automated, and on the other hand, we have those occupations, those 47%, that would be at high risk of automation. And in line probably with our expectation, those occupations that are not so much at risk of being automated would be the ones in education, healthcare, etc. So where you work more with people, while on the other hand, we have those occupations that are at high risk of being automated. So there we would have, for example, the office and administrative support workers, people who work in the service industry or in sales, etc. All right, so yeah, this led us to the question of, are those people who are in the high risk category actually perceiving themselves as such? Or yeah, are they afraid that their occupations might either be lost or significantly change? And for this, I first need to distinguish what we term occupation insecurity from other forms of workplace insecurity, because you might rightly be asking yourself, hasn't that been done before? Don't we already have a measure for this? Well, there is something called career insecurity, for example, as a concept, but this concept deals with the uncertainty how to succeed in one's chosen career. So this is not necessarily due to automation. Similarly, another concept called employment insecurity or talks about the number of options available to employees within their country. So this is then dependent on the country's economy, on the number of big global corporations present in that country, etc. What could be closest to our concept of occupation insecurity could be techno-stress, because this is actually a concept that deals with the struggles that people are facing due to evolving technology. However, when looking at this concept a little bit more closely, it actually consists of multiple subdimensions. And the one subdimension that would be the closest to occupation insecurity could be techno-insecurity. However, if you then look at the specific items that have been developed to measure techno-insecurity, one item, for example, reads, "I feel there is less sharing of knowledge among coworkers for fear of being replaced." So this taps also into interesting aspects, but into slightly different aspects, since we were mostly interested in measuring, are people afraid of their occupations actually disappearing or changing significantly? Of course, the major one that we've been hearing about in the previous presentations would be job insecurity, so both qualitative and quantitative. But occupation insecurity is also different from job insecurity, and I'm going to go into that on the next slide. Just previously, as has been mentioned in those previous presentations, that quantitative and qualitative job insecurity tends to have all these negative health and well-being outcomes for employees, and we expect that occupation insecurity would actually also be similar in that area, that it would also negatively impact employees in that regard. But okay, let's distinguish occupation insecurity from job insecurity. Namely, a job is what a person is currently performing at a specific organization. And in contrast, an occupation is a trade or profession that has been learned through training, and it also requires a certain level of professional knowledge. So if we look at an example, we have this food server here on the slide. So his job would be a specific job at a specific restaurant. So if this restaurant was to close, or maybe they were laying people off, he could apply at any other restaurant and be a food server there. However, if the food serving industry becomes more and more automated, and we are seeing that, right, by having these self-service terminals, by using more tablets at the tables, etc., then it becomes more difficult. So he cannot just go to the next restaurant and apply for a job, because they will need fewer food servers, or maybe at some point no food servers. So that means that in this case, our food server would possibly need to go out, get some different skills, maybe need to retrain, or maybe switch to a different occupation. So in this case, occupation insecurity, or that means that occupation insecurity is a broader term than job insecurity. It's kind of taking job insecurity to the next level. However, similarly to job insecurity, it's also a subjective perception, meaning the person objectively could actually be in a category of an occupation that is not so much at risk of being automated, but maybe subjectively they still have this feeling of, I'm not sure what automation will be doing to my occupation. And then there's this element of uncertainty, that it's an involuntary state that people are being placed into. And as I mentioned, the big difference with job insecurity is that moving to a different organization is not an option, because the occupation itself might have become obsolete or might have changed significantly. So that's why we set out to develop this scale for occupation insecurity. And in order to get a better grasp of the concept, and also in order to develop our set of items, we conducted focus groups in 3 different countries, in the UK, Belgium, and China. Then we gathered existing workplace insecurity scales, so we did extensive research on what kind of scales are already out there, and we interviewed subject matter experts, and with all of this, we generated our first large set of items. Then we reduced the set of items with a pilot survey that we conducted in Belgium, and then also conducted cognitive interviews with prospective participants to make sure that all the items could be easily understood by people. And lastly, we conducted a big quantitative survey in 5 countries to further validate our scale. So just to give you the definition of occupation insecurity, I've mentioned it a few times, but just so how we define occupation insecurity would be the perceived fear that due to automation, one may not be able to remain in paid employment in one's current occupation, or that the occupation will significantly change. And now when we started to validate our scale, we actually found that 2 subscales emerged, namely subscales along the lines of quantitative and qualitative job insecurity, what we have heard in those previous presentations. So one subscale that emerged, we termed global occupation insecurity. So that would be along the lines of quantitative job insecurity, in the sense that it would be the fear of the whole occupation disappearing. And then the second one was content occupation insecurity, so along the lines of qualitative job insecurity, namely the fear of the occupation becoming significantly different, even if the occupation as a whole may not disappear. So in the end, we have now 6 items to measure global occupation insecurity and 5 items to measure content occupation insecurity. And I will not read through all of those, but just to give you an example. So the first item for global occupation insecurity would read, I am worried that my occupation will not be needed anymore in the future due to the advancement of technology. And the first item for content occupation insecurity would be, I expect that my occupation will undergo significant changes due to technological developments. And now coming to the validation of that scale, we collected more than 1,000 survey responses in the UK, so that we would be working with native speakers through a data collection agency called Respondi. Thanks to them, we were able to collect a national representative sample in terms of age, gender, and region. And we also collected a boost sample so that we targeted employees that were specifically at high risk, according to that Frey and Osborne paper I mentioned earlier, namely administrative and support staff, and one group that would be at low risk, namely education. 54% were female, and we targeted employees, so between 18 and 65 years old. And as you can see, in terms of education and occupational position, our sample fell into that medium category, or the majority of it. In terms of measures, we of course included our occupation insecurity, or in short, OCIS scale. Then we measured job insecurity, both quantitative and qualitative, and also career insecurity. If we look at the results of the confirmatory factor analysis, we see that if we only look at global and content, we get very good fit indices, and all of the items load on the factors as expected. And if we then put in 5 factors, so global and content occupation insecurity, the 2 job insecurity measures, and also career insecurity, then we see again, we get very good fit indices, and also again, all of the items load on the respective factors as expected. For those 2 subscales, we also get very good reliability, and we found scalar invariance across age, gender, and position. In terms of incremental validity, the picture still needs to be further explored, so we found incremental validity with burnout as an outcome for global occupation insecurity over quantitative job insecurity. However, we could not find the same for content occupation insecurity over qualitative job insecurity. So that is something to be further looked into. When it comes to correlations with other outcome variables, they are as expected, namely that for both global and content, they would be significant and negative for outcomes such as job and life satisfaction and work engagement, and that they would be positive and significant for burnout, counterproductive work behavior, and turnover intention. And as I promised you some preliminary results before I wrap up, namely in terms of prevalence, we see that people, or at least in the sample, tended to experience slightly higher content than global occupation insecurity. And if we specifically look at our high versus low risk occupations, we see some preliminary evidence that maybe the subjective perception might be aligned to the objective situation, namely those who were in the objectively high risk category also tended to experience higher global and content occupation insecurity. Then if looking at some specific items, what we can see is that with one item over here, we asked people whether they are afraid that they need to switch occupations in the short term, so within 1 or 2 years, due to automation versus the long term, so 5 to 10 years. And we can see that more people agree or partially agree that they would need to switch long term than short term. And lastly, when it comes to training, here we even see that the majority of people, at least partially or maybe even strongly, agreed that they will need additional training in order to be able to keep working in their current occupation. So yes, we are conducting this research in the hope of starting a dialogue and addressing some of these concerns that employees may have in terms of their occupations or the future of their occupations in light of automation, and to further then in the future be able to support them in getting those skills they need and to make sure that they feel prepared for the changes ahead. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions. Any questions?
I guess we both did a good job. Okay.
Great, well, thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you all for sticking it out through the end of the last session at SciOp. I really appreciate, again, your attendance here. And I guess I'll just leave it open. If any of you have questions, you're free to come up afterwards and talk to us individually. So again, thank you all for being here.